Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing kind of a little bit of a twofer. We're going to be talking about Comparative Advantage, and we're going to be talking about this mod, Realms of Exether. Now this is a fantasy overhaul mod that introduces a bunch of different things, like races, magic, different type of magical schools, a whole bunch of different goods, and a whole bunch of different buildings. And what I think that this mod does really well, that is interesting as it relates to playing vanilla, is it creates opportunities for comparative advantage. That is, playing as a different race or playing with a different set of magic allows you to have such a substantive advantage that it changes the playthrough in a significant way. And I think that this is something that's not present in vanilla to the extent it should be, and is definitely something that is historically important. And so in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be first taking a look at comparative advantage, some of the effects you have in comparative advantage in vanilla, because it is present, and then we're going to be taking a little bit of a closer look at this mod here, Realms of Exether. Hi dear brothers, because we are going to be talking about a concept made by the very strapping David Ricardo, which is that of comparative advantage, which is kind of an important element to understand why it works or how it works, in order to understand why we should specialize in the game or what our incentive looks like for specialization. And this is a theory that is very important, which shows that even if you're better than another country at producing everything, it could still be useful to trade with that country. There were some glimmerings of this kind of concept available in some people before David Ricardo, but David Ricardo kind of really nailed it down. And in order to highlight this, we're going to use some numbers from our Victoria 3 spreadsheet, hide your children, and your mother, everyone's got to hide today, because we're going to kind of take some values from textile mills, and we're going to assume, we're going to compare a hypothetical EIC to the UK, where we're on hand-sewn clothing for the EIC and electric sewing for the UK, and we're going to cross-compare it with cotton plantations where we're on automatic irrigation for the UK and basic production for the EIC, so the UK has an advantage in both. In this, we will be looking at specifically technology as a creator of a comparative advantage, but I just want to kind of emphasize here that this is not meant to be a sort of prescriptive exploration of comparative advantage here. It's supposed to highlight a concept. There's a bunch of other factors that influence how you should trade, why you should produce your own things, and that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. Right now, we're just trying to talk about comparative advantage, and all of this is relativized to per week of construction, the amount of value you can produce. So if the United Kingdom spends a week of construction on building clothing manufactories, they will be able to produce 50 of value. If they spend it on cotton, they will be able to produce 170 of value. And for the AIC, 18.3 and 80 respectively when looking at the PMs that we looked at. So at first blush, there are two very intuitive judgments that look like they might be correct, but they're not actually correct. And these two judgments are, first of all, we look, and as the United Kingdom, we say, hey, we're better at producing both of these things. We should just produce these things ourselves and not trade with the East India Company. The second thing that might come to mind is, hey, look, we're really, really good at producing cotton. We should produce a lot of that. Now, remember, we are excluding a bunch of other factors in this analysis just to kind of highlight comparative advantage. In reality, Victoria 3, often you tank the price of cotton, and what you end up getting is, since cotton is cheap, it's not actually as efficient as this kind of 170 figure looks like. But in the context of this kind of evaluation, it might make sense to make a lot of cotton. Well, what happens is the UK is actually much better at producing clothing relative to cotton, relative to how good the East India Company is at producing clothing relative to cotton. And there's three relatives in that sentence, which is too many relatives. It sounds like Thanksgiving, but whenever you're evaluating what you should do in any type of like kind of game theory scenario, you should always think of things in terms of opportunity cost. What are you giving up in order to produce this thing? And when you look at things in this way, it becomes a lot more clear why it is the case that the United Kingdom should specialize in clothing. For every unit of clothing that they want to produce, what they need to give up is 3.4 units of cotton, because cotton, the amount of cotton they could produce with the same amount of construction producing a new building, if we divide it by the amount of clothing, we will get 3.4. If we perform the same operation for the East India Company, we will get a much larger figure that is 4.37. So the East India Company is said to have a relative advantage in producing cotton. In an absolute sense, it's worse at producing cotton than the United Kingdom, but relative to the United Kingdom, in terms of a comparative advantage, relative to other things it could produce, it can produce cotton better than the United Kingdom can. Similarly, the United Kingdom instead has a relative advantage, or a comparative advantage rather, in producing clothing. They can produce clothing much better. So what should happen is the United Kingdom should produce additional clothing, more than it would consume, and then trade that clothing to the East India Company so that both can benefit. Now, of course, we have colonization, and the only one who benefited was the UK, and one of the reasons the United Kingdom historically was not able to actually industrialize themselves is because they weren't allowed to. Shout out to Great Britain, industry and empire. We've read about that quite a bit in that book, but this is one of the facets, and also why, the industry ban is kind of a historic thing. But if we consider the scenario of, hey, what happens if we trade 100 clothing for 390 cotton? Notice, that's about halfway in between 3.9 to 1. That's about halfway in between this ratio of 3.4 to 1 and 4.3 to 1. Well, what will happen? The United Kingdom could have produced their opportunity cost in terms of cotton they could have produced when they produce 100 clothing, considering this will cost them 2 weeks of construction effectively to produce 100 clothing, 2 times 50, they could have produced 340 cotton. But when they are trading for 390 cotton, they will receive 390 cotton. So the amount of value they have effectively gained by engaging in this trade, even though they are in an absolute sense much better at producing cotton than the East India Company, since they're receiving considerably more, they will gain a little over 10% value for 114% of their initial investment. From this number, we're just dividing this by this in order to get this 114% here. Similarly, the East India Company will be giving up, in order to produce this 390 cotton, they will have to be giving up the opportunity to instead produce 89.2 units of clothing, because the clothing has an efficiency here, and what they will be receiving instead is going to be 100 clothing, which is greater than the 89. So the amount of value they're getting is a little over 10%, and so it makes sense. Even though the UK is better at producing everything, the East India Company has a comparative advantage in this. And so as a result of this, the East India Company should choose to specialize in cotton, and the United Kingdom should choose to specialize in clothing, and they should just both run enormous amounts of trade and both benefit every single time they construct excess of the goods so that they trade it. They are effectively gaining a little over 10% value from themselves. So technology is just one example in which you can acquire a comparative advantage. And kind of just briefly, one of the problems is everyone tends to acquire the same technologies because there's no opportunity cost in technologies, in the sense of which technology you're going to pick. Everyone gets the same tech tree, and instead your opportunity is which one do I research first. And so you will have timing windows where you have a really strong comparative advantage. Like if you open as the UK by researching water tube boiler, you'll be able to export iron and coal really well. However, other countries are going to go with water tube boiler, and your comparative advantage will go away. And since everyone's going to eventually catch up on tech, instead it's just going to be timing windows as far as the tech is concerned, in which you have a very specific advantage, although sometimes the AI won't catch up. Two kind of very important techs are going to be the pump jacks tech, which will give you the last tier of plantations. Kind of when other countries get on this and you might be better at manufacturing, this will be an interesting breakpoint where importing all of the stuff from them is really good. But also, this is one of the few text that leads to kind of different play patterns, which is if you are a country that is somehow wanting to focus on agriculture, specifically plantations, and you get pump jacks early, man, are you going to be really good at this stuff, and you can kind of to some extent export it, and so the EIC rushing pump jacks is a very reasonable thing to do. Another one, and this comes real late, is going to be compression ignition, and compression ignition is an absolutely outstanding tech and will really make you want to emphasize kind of all mines over everything else, but other than that, there aren't any techs that just scream, huge, enormous advantage. Maybe the tooling tech in vulcanization is an example of one, allowing you to specialize in tools and export a lot of tools. So maybe there's a few techs, but everyone is going to kind of catch up. And the pump jacks and compression ignition in particular are techs you can get way before and have an advantage for way longer. I guess vulcanization also kind of comes in there, although this isn't necessarily a video on which techs you can get the best comparative advantage on. Other sources of comparative advantage are going to be, or another big one is going to be, all the bonuses that you get towards throughput. So for example, you might be getting a throughput bonus that another country is not from economies of scale because you've decided to build up to level 50. The AI is generally bad at this, and as a result, generally speaking, you can export manufactured goods to the AI and import agricultural goods, all other political considerations aside and manipulating your private queue aside, you will tend to have a higher average throughput in your country on manufactured goods than they will, and you oftentimes cannot pursue a max economies of scale throughput on something like livestock ranches because there isn't enough levels to be had. And so this is one way you can get a comparative advantage in throughput, and truly there's a lot of ways you can get a comparative advantage in throughput. You can also get a comparative advantage in throughput by slotting in companies. So if you have a company that another country doesn't have, or the AI tends to actually not slot in very good companies, this can inform what you might have an advantage in. You can also have in particular state bonuses. And so the one that comes to mind most is probably Russia's taiga forests kind of bonus, which gives you 20% logging industry throughput. Although stronger than a throughput bonus is an output bonus, and 25% hardwood building output is nothing to slouch over, these will allow you to have advantages in something like wood, which other countries do not necessarily have, allowing you to focus them a little more. It is specifically when you layer these advantages that they become particularly robust, and so combining not just a wood kind of bonus in terms of the state bonuses, which is giving us throughput, or in this case output, but combining this with a company on top of that will lead to an even more robust advantage. However, there's kind of a problem with all of this as it relates to Victoria 3 replayability and gameplay patterns, which is that, generally speaking, you're all getting the same tech, right? And what the best tech is just going to be the best tech for everyone, because there's nothing unique about the countries from country to country, other than you can make small arguments for state bonuses, and you can make an argument for companies, but for the most part, you can slot in companies for the industries you want. And this means that there's not really a specialization in tech. And the best tech is you're generally going to push it with every country with a few small minor adjustments, which is like if you're playing someone that has like a ton of EIC just comes to mind as one of the very few that maybe you want to go pump jacks over going for, more industrially oriented stuff. But if you're researching all the same techs on every country because they're the best techs, and you're researching all the same, or you're utilizing all the same companies, you're going to have the exact same comparative advantage relative to every other run, and you're going to run the game much in the same way, and there's not a lot of replayability because the kind of margins at which you acquire an advantage that is unique to your country relative to other countries is going to be minimal. Like some people are going to have slightly different throughput on, the agricultural group. Like I think Egypt has a slightly different one, Brazil has a slightly different one, where they are getting like more plantations output or more ranches output, and like this is a very minor thing, but the rural folks suck, and you don't want to lean into them anyways, and so it ends up not really being much of an advantage. The only one I guess I could even think of that you would want to intentionally lean into that would give you a comparative advantage would be maybe Sweden, who, if I recall correctly, their petite bourgeoisie has a mining bonus, mines throughput, except for here's the problem. Mines are generally what you want to focus anyways because mines are strongest, so this doesn't lead to a different gameplay pattern. You're just a little bit better at that gameplay pattern if you happen to lean into the petite bourgeoisie. And so for the most part, the metagame across Victoria 3 doesn't have a lot for replayability because it just forces you into the same gameplay patterns over and over and over again, because you're not going to be having a different comparative advantage relative to the AI, depending on who you play. You might be able to squeeze one out against players where the types of industries you can build are significantly gated. The expansion paths are not open to you because of human players and human intervention, and this might lead to slightly different things, like you go agricultural as the EIC. Another thing is, beyond this, there are other reasons why you don't get a lot of specialization, and you don't get a lot of comparative advantages in vanilla. The first reason is, generally speaking, as the game goes on, and this is maybe not the best example because we're only 10 years in here with this Great Britain run, you tend to start dominating the market, and as you acquire a bigger and bigger share of the market, knowing that the East India Company is propped up by us right now and is inside of our market, the notion of trade suddenly becomes, or starts to become, gradually obsolete as the game gets deeper. This is more of a problem with AI than a problem with specialization or comparative advantage, but the second you can't specialize because you're running 50% of the economy and you just have to build everything anyways, some of the tools that you use to specialize, like using companies, start to change in a way that you do not actually want to specialize as hard. So for example, we could slot in multiple iron companies in order to get a stacking iron advantage. In fact, we actually do have 2 iron companies in here right now. We also have 2 steel companies. The problem with this is that you gain most of the benefit from the first company, and if you end up producing a larger and larger share of the world's economy and you cannot trade more and more, the value of specializing in this way gets significantly worse, and you actually want to spread out your companies and have a variety of different companies so that you can benefit from having the first company, which is worth more because it gives you more throughput. Throughput is more valuable the less of you have of it, so if you already have a company, the marginal company, even if it gave the same amount of throughput, wouldn't be as valuable. When you're on 100% throughput, and you add another 50 or 100% throughput on top of that, you are effectively doubling the value of the building. But if you already have plus 100 and you add another additional plus 100, you're only adding an additional 50%. So baseline plus 100%, you're doubling it. Plus 200%, that marginal extra 100% is only adding a 50% more relative to the baseline, so additional throughput is less useful insofar as it is affecting the overall economy, but it's more useful if it allows you to specialize deeper. This isn't a gameplay pattern for a reason of your country will very quickly exhaust its trade partners and all the buy and sell orders of the things, and then you have to start diversifying rather than specializing so hard. Again, this is a problem more with the AI than necessarily with the kind of what's going on itself in Victoria 3, and if you're playing with a bunch of human players, this will not be the effect. The second thing is trade. Now, many of the systems in trade actually push you towards generalizing, which pushes you away from having comparative advantages and stylistic gameplay, and instead kind of constructing a homogeneous, type of economy that looks the same for every single country. And there's kind of 2 factors that are going on here. The first is that convoys are relatively expensive, kind of compared to what you're doing, and very often it's going to be better for you to not specialize in something, instead build a different good, not have to pay the convoy cost in order to try and reap the benefit of comparative advantage, and just not trade, because convoys are relatively expensive. I mean, you do want to do it sometimes. I'm not saying don't trade and don't build convoys for the purpose of trade, but some of that 10% value figure we were looking at when we were looking at the notion of trading is significantly inhibited by the expense of convoys, as well as another effect we'll talk about. But also the convoy system is kind of paired with the overland system, which is that if we try and run an import route and we are going to import, let's say, fabric, you'll notice a bunch of these are 0 level. You will have, if you have an overland route with anyone, you will be able to run up to a certain level. I think it's either level 4 or 5 for free, not spending any convoys. And what this means is that you can do this for a bunch of different goods and increase the total volume of trade by an enormous amount, but they have to be different goods. And this discourages specialization, which further discourages kind of developing any sort of comparative advantage or stylistic advantage over another country. You can see if we sort by units, and we just take a look at where all of our volume of trade is going, almost all of it's just going to the China. It's going on several different route types, and this just eats basically all the convoys we have available for trade. And you'll notice we aren't actually developing, we are trying to have an advantage in tools. We have a tool company, Us exporting opium is because opium's way too expensive in their market because they're obsessed with it, and then we're importing two things that they have a comparative advantage relative to us, and then after that, that's kind of where, you know, our comparative advantage stylistic gameplay goes to die, because roughly everything else is just using 0 convoys or the amount of convoys that are needed for the level 1 route, and not much else, because all the convoys are dedicated to the China route. And so even though we are exporting stuff like iron, we are exporting stuff like coal, the routes are not really increasing in size, despite us having a bunch of companies for these types of things as a result of trade. And this is, it's not like you get a certain amount of levels per country, which would be a system that would allow us to specialize an amount of free levels per country. It's free levels per country per good. And so this means that you don't want to go deep, you don't want to specialize, and you don't want to lean into a particular good you're producing, and instead you want to produce a little bit of everything. Now, on top of this, I think we already mentioned it, the trade centers should be building the convoys. This is a weird abstraction. Like, the shipping lanes should be defended by the nation, but the trade centers should be producing the convoys, and that should be built into some of the payout that goes into them, and it should have stimulating effects of this type of stuff. But trade should probably not be as expensive as it is, and it's been significantly depressed relative to earlier portions in the game's history when it was a much more important thing. In particular, patch 1.5 saw trade get very, very significantly nerfed by a thing that is called local prices, or as it's often called, MAPI, which is short for Market Access Price Impact. Now, 1.5, we did get companies. That allowed us to specialize, and that gave us comparative advantage, but we're kind of just using them on the same, same industries every single time. But what MAPI did is it really made trading a whole lot worse, or overbuilding any sort of good for the purpose of trade a lot worse because of how MAPI works. And the way it works is there's a local price for goods now, and if we take a look here in Lancashire, we can see the local price. Whenever a good is being super overproduced, as it is here in Lancashire, it's being produced 2,000 and there's only 790 buy orders, what we're doing is we're actually shipping it out. And so what the price is relative to local is actually minus 11%. And this creates a really extreme negative effect on the economy, and it's being overcome by us having a bunch of advantages here in Lancashire in terms of throughput, having a company, the coal industry being really good, us having a tech advantage in here, and it's overcoming this effect, but it's still really dampening our ability to specialize in a good and lean into it. And the way it is doing this is 85% of the price is going to be market price. 15% of the price is going to be this local price, and whenever you trade, you never influence a local price anywhere, you only ever influence the market price. And so when we are selling a bunch of stuff from Lancashire and we're exporting a bunch to, let's say, Spain, what ends up happening is it only affects the market price of the good. So 15% of the price here in Lancashire, we're selling Lancashire coal, is not affected by this trade route. And this is going to be similarly when we are looking at Spain, they're going to receive the exact same effect for whatever MAPI they have when they are consuming the coal. If we come over here and we take a look at coal over here in Spain, we will see that 25% of the price is informed by the local price in terms of the real price, and 75% is in terms of the market price. So that means as we ship a bunch of sell orders here, this doesn't pull down the market, or sorry, the local price, the price that's being actually paid out, by as much as it should. Instead, it's only being pulled down by 75% of the amount. And since it's not pulling it down more, our trade route is not as big as it otherwise should be, and also all the industries that are being fed into are not being aided as much as they otherwise would be here in Spain. And so to kind of take a look at a bit of the math on this and hide your children, we will kind of jump into the spreadsheet here, and what we will do is we will go to this MAPI kind of panel here. And what this is we are looking at 85%. Notably, Spain didn't have 85%. We had 85%. Spain is behind on tech, or they have a bad law. I'm not sure exactly what's the case in Spain. Shout out to Spain. But what is going on here is when there is a glut, as we had with Lancashire, this pulls the price down by 11% in the location where there is a glut. And so if we kind of come over here and we look at, specifically, let's look at a coal mine, because that's what we were looking at earlier, and we see that we have an efficiency per week of construction in 60. Well, If we are selling the stuff, overselling it, and we have a glut that pulls down the price relative to the market by 11%, what's going to happen is the value of our output is going to be pulled down by 11%, and we're just going to pull it down by 200, which is roughly 11%, and we'll see what happens to the efficiency per week of construction. If we just pull this down quite a bit, we will see that it goes down by something like 16%. That's an enormous amount, which means that it's not good for us to specialize anymore because we can't really trade well because of this mappy effect. But it's also received again at the other end, which is going to decrease our size of our trade routes, which is that the price that is going to be the degree to which our exports push stuff down in other prices in other countries, push the price down, is going to be significantly smaller, and so we are going to end up having smaller trade routes as well, which is going to further not let us push up the price of coal as much as we would like to, so that we can sell more, and so this will have a secondary kind of depressing effect on the price, which trade has not really been or felt very good since then, because what ends up happening is if this is down 16%, well, shoot, I might as well just, produce it myself. And so then we see Spain, seeing that it's not as profitable to import it, is just going to end up producing it themselves, and the trade routes diminish in size, and you don't get as much overall trade. Also, they hugely nerf the amount of convoys you get, dramatically increasing the price of these convoys, leading to a lot of your trade being focused on overland routes. This can lead to some weird gameplay patterns, like conquering areas just so you can get an adjacency, so you can run free overland trade routes, right? So going after Guyana from the Netherlands to get a free adjacency with France and Great Britain, going after Guatemala just to get the adjacency on Mexico, going after Amur. Now, to be fair, a lot of these places are pretty good to take otherwise. Amur has a ton of gold, which gives you an adjacency on Qing and Russia, going after Brunei for the adjacency to Lanfang, which is part of Russia's market and is also adjacent to the Dutch market. And when you do this, you can get free convoys, because the overland stuff is always free, even though shipping stuff overland is, and probably should be, more expensive than doing it by boat, because the doing it by boat is this like great connection and globalization was created by this. Great Britain, one of the things that happened to Great Britain is, towards the later part of the 19th century, they actually kind of collapsed industrially, and they provided finance and freight, and this was the source of their power. But doing stuff overseas is just categorically really, really weak in the game. And it's very strange that we can take Guyana in order to get a bunch of free trade with Great Britain and France, which aren't even properly connected here. And instead what ends up happening is you will end up, if you are playing Great Britain, have to pay an enormous amount of convoys in order to maintain your adjacencies, because overland stuff is free. Port connections, and this includes not just trade routes but also port connections, are really expensive when you do not have an overland route to the market capital. So we end up paying enormous amounts for Great Britain to connect to the EIC, and this is something that in the mid to late game UK struggles with. But if we compare them to someone like Russia, if Russia controls the EIC, or they eventually transfer the EIC, and they just snake a land bridge down to the EIC, they will have to pay 0 in convoys for port connections relative to the UK, even though there's no way that this would have gone overland over this route or this mountainous terrain all the way in order to get to the Russian heartland. No, it would have gone by sea. But the way the game abstracts it is overland routes are free, and they are free up to a certain level for trade, and that it further makes it so you can't specialize, which further reduces kind of the effect or the simulation as it relates to kind of comparative advantage in the vanilla base game in a very kind of strange way as it relates to convoys. So that brings us to the realm of Exether mod, which doesn't really overcome a lot of kind of the points we've made in regards to how specialization is kind of crimped in vanilla, but instead it has a bunch of other things that help to overcome that. Before we get into that, I wanted to do a little bit of a quick overview of the mod. Now, this is a fantasy mod inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. There is a ton of different races. You could see that we are here playing as some humans. There are dwarves that appear. There are elves. There are Dark Elves. I think they're down here. There are also Draconian type of people. There are Dragon people. There are Goblins. There are Orcs. And very, very significantly for all of these, or majority of these, some are not unique. We see Bird people too. They do have a little bit of unique stuff in terms of technology. We have the human superiority tech, and this kind of gives us our first differentiation amongst races, is they are going to have different techs, and these will give you different sorts of things you can focus on. And notably, as it relates to kind of what we were discussing in terms of comparative advantage, these aren't the same for every country. The fact that you are going to have some texts that are going to be different is a very substantive differentiation, and these can force you to play differently, allowing you to have different sort of gameplay. But kind of more on the mod, as far as I can remember from the lore, and to be fair, I'm not as much an expert, this Veil Integrity kind of belies a very interesting thing that they're working on. This mod is in development. They seem to be very aggressively developing. It's come along a ton in the past 2 months, but this is not currently implemented. But the lore behind this is the two gods battled in this land. They duked it out, and then they both took a nap. And as Veil Integrity decreases, which it decreases because you are industrializing, there will be some sort of doomsday mechanic wherein the gods are waking up, and magic is getting more and more magic is getting unleashed upon the land as you industrialize, and this will give you some sort of endgame crisis, which I think is a very fascinating thing, especially because as you get deeper and deeper into the game tends to get more straightforward and easy and this type of thing, and so having a mechanic like this lends to some interesting things. There are a ton of new different types of buildings and new different types of industries, like a whole ton, and they all kind of feed into stuff. They are balanced in very interesting ways. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, but there's a lot of new stuff going on. And a lot of this new stuff does kind of not necessarily have art assets yet, so there can be some overlapping art assets, but that is definitely okay. And kind of beyond the racial bonuses, all the different countries you can play, perhaps there are formables and lore and a little bit of unique interest group titles and this type of stuff for a lot of this, as well as events all throughout. We won't cover those, but the other big thing that's kind of here to focus on is the Arcana card system. Now, this system really leads into some significant things as it relates to shaking things up for gameplay across different runs. But what this is these are magic. You can have an institution that gives you Arcana points, and then you can invest these Arcana points in cards. These function very, very similar to companies. It is, in fact, using the company's user interface in order to put this in, but you may notice some of these bonuses are absolutely insane, like coal output and iron output. This is output, not throughput. So this does not increase the input cost, it just increases the output, and it is also multiplicatively effective with throughput, which is a very important point we'll come back to later when we kind of talk about our runs. But in particular, every single country will only get 2 categories on the Arcana cards, and there's no way to unlock new categories, which means you're going to have to decide which Arcana cards are going to be best for your combination, and then you have to play around your Arcana cards in terms of trying to, be as optimal as possible. And it is this, I think, in my opinion, that is the heart of being able to have different sorts of comparative advantages from one run to the other, and instead of constructing the exact same economy every time, sometimes you get a bonus like this, which makes it so that, hey, we're going coal and iron focused in this run in particular. So in order to kind of take a look at some of this stuff, we're going to take a look at one of the runs, or a couple of the runs that we did on this mod. Now, since we started these runs, the map has been janked up, which is why it looks all spaghetti fronty, and the states are all funny looking. But this is just a result of them updating the map since we've started, which is kind of a testament to the fact that they're updating it. But we still should be able to highlight some of the ideas and features which make this country Ravik unique, which has caused us to play the game a little bit differently. So first of all, we have for our companies kind of what looks like a very standard company set for Victoria 3. And a big part of why we play it this way, instead of leading into something like gizmos, which is a good that we did on a different run, is that we have the aforementioned coal and iron output cards, which are particularly strong. We also have one for magical industries throughput and one for workforce ratio. Notably, in terms of our race, we do have a play pattern that has led to something quite different. We have gnomish research. I think that this is probably the most unique one in terms of gameplay patterns. It gives innovation, it gives political strength to a party that is created in this mod. It unlocks gnomish tinkering in the subsistence farms, which is a bit interesting. It creates gizmos, which is a new trade good, and in particular it unlocks the soul rod assembly, which is a very interesting one because it produces population. That's right, we can build them. You said you could fix them, we said we can build him. We are building population, which is, we're building them out of these industries here. You can see here the weak balance is negative, mainly because we're subsidizing it, and the input goods are expensive, but what's happening is every month, 27,000 pops are produced and then added to the state, which is an insane thing, which actually led us to a gameplay pattern that we have not considered before. Is because we don't really need pops that bad and we can build them ourselves, we can build a bitch, we maybe just wanted to stay on slavery. And this is an interesting decision point that we thought about for some time, and we ended up banning slavery anyways, so we could go multiculturalism to try and pull people in the block. But in the end, I think that was a mistake. I think we were supposed to stay on slavery, largely as a result of the fact that this mod has introduced a kind of gameplay pattern where we don't need to rely on the migration and this sort of thing because we have a unique building, because we're gnomes, and this has allowed us to look at laws in a different way. But not only laws in a different way, labor-saving PMs seem really bad for these guys when you can just build more pops. Generally, labor-saving PMs are good when you start running out of peasants. We're not going to run out of peasants. We are considerably into the game. We have a 600 million GDP, and we still have a ton of peasants because we're building them. They say the most important resource in Victoria 3 is souls, but technically the guys we're building don't have any souls. But I just wanted to highlight also something else that I thought was a really interesting thing about this mod and some decision points we've made in this mod, which is, okay, first of all, just to be clear, these are all a bunch of different types of industries and goods, and a lot of these kind of have weird overlap. For example, we have these fish, and these fish, they can produce iron instead of fish. Very strangeness, but the PMs overall seem balanced. The thing I wanted to draw your attention to is not only is there balance in PMs, there are more options there aren't, and initially I didn't like this. You could see here, not that one, in this one, we will have a couple of options, and you will notice here we have these advanced rock rollers, which consume 3 gizmos, and we have Steam Donkey, which consume an engine and 3 coal. And in this instance, they're both saving the same amount of labor. There's a lot of PMs like this, a whole lot of PMs like this, where roughly speaking, they are all equivalent to each other in terms of the overall value that's been created for the price of the input goods at base price, which leads to having to think a lot about which one of these things is better. But in this particular case, we are at an interesting intersection where for one of the countries we played, we used rock rollers, and for this country that we're playing now, we're using Steam Donkey. And partially it's because we had different advantages, but remember what I said quite some time ago when I was talking about, hey, usually you get really big and it makes it harder to specialize in different industries, because what ends up happening is because you're such a large share of the world's economy overall, you can't really specialize anymore. Well, here's an interesting thing. With this, instead of being shooed into using particular goods for a PM, this is effectively a PM that has 2 different inputs. We can either input 3 gizmos, or we can input 4 coal and an engine, which means we have a choice to specialize further internally with our own economy for a particular good, because we have an advantage in producing it, which allows us to create buy orders in our market for more of these goods that we're really good at producing without having to rely on trade, and we can create buy orders that are kind of tailored to exactly the way we are controlling our economy, which I thought was a very interesting thing. Roughly speaking, the gizmos and the engines, if I recall correctly, are, in terms of base price, they're roughly the same. I forget what the base price of an engine is. The base price of a gizmo is 60. I think the base price of an engine is 80, so this is 180, and the base price of these is 30, so 120 plus 60 is 180, 180. They're both the same base prices. But the fact that we have a decision that is interesting and is going to, we are going to do it differently based on different runs, I thought was just super, super fascinating. Also, throughout the game, I think that overall, since there are so many different new resources, it feels that, if we look at the resources, there's Cloud Silver. We don't have a lot of Cloud Silver, and we could conquer to get a lot more Cloud Silver, but this isn't exactly what we have a lot of at this point in time, and so this pushes us in terms of options. If we have an option between using Cloud Silver and using something else, we won't use that something else, because of what the hand we're dealt. We happen to have a lot of haunted grounds, except we've already constructed them all, because these feed into our people assembly in terms of our pop factories, and so I think that probably more so than vanilla, the resource hand that you're sort of dealt at the start is going to inform your decision making quite a bit more than vanilla, and I thought that this was interesting as well. Let's take a look at the other run and kind of draw a little bit of comparisons against this one. Before we do, I just wanted to focus on kind of our market glance a little bit, because you can really get a feel for us being able to specialize a lot more. So first of all, the iron and coal is so disgustingly efficient because we are layering throughput bonuses on top of an output bonus, and they're multiplicatively effective with each other, that we can afford way more convoys. And with those convoys, we are exporting way more coal and iron. Now, the UK just having the 3 huge routes to China, part of that is a product of China just having an enormous market. And that's fair enough. And our top 3 trade routes here are also with an enormous market. They're with the number 2 GP. But if you scroll down, you see a lot of iron and coal. And then if we also sort by, revenue or productivity, you will see a lot of iron and coal in there. And so this is just a testament to how robust our specialization is and how this is kind of informing our play, where we are choosing to focus on this thing. But I think pretty interesting also is this one, which I wanted to draw attention to. We are importing a huge amount of paper, and part of the reason why we are not building this paper ourselves, why we are choosing to incur the MAPI penalty rather than foregoing an opportunity to build a profitable opportunity to build paper here. Part of this is, if we take a look at the company, or the country rather, we're importing it from, and we take a look at their overall country, that is their country, and we take a look at diplomacy, I think it's under domestic then, we will see something a little interesting. Hey, they have a paper company, which is giving them throughput and allowing them to specialize, which is allowing us to have this dual specialization going, where they have a comparative advantage in paper. We have a comparative advantage in, coal and iron, and so as a result, we have this enormous trade thing going on. Now, to be fair, we probably should even consider importing clothes from them, and I wouldn't be shocked if regular clothes or even luxury clothes would import at a really good rate because they also have a company. Nope, it would not be profitable enough to overcome just how good our convoy trade routes with iron and coal are, and it looks like, I'm guessing, that we're actually exporting to them despite them having an industry for it. But you can really see our specialization is quite strong, and we have built so many convoys up relative to kind of vanilla, just because it is way more profitable for us to build the convoys and the goods we're specializing in, rather than to continue to build like different other industries, because of the sheer negative effect of MAPI making it so that it's like not worth it to, if an industry is not way better, it's better to just build something that's going to have better MAPI than to build something just for the purpose of export. But we are able to overcome that modifier. If we look and sort by sell orders, you can see just how many sell orders of iron and coal we are producing relative to everything else. And the other really big one we're producing an enormous amount of is wood, which is really good at depeasanting, which we are pushing really aggressively because we have the free pops sort of situation going on. And until very recently in this run, we were also trying to specifically increase hardwood output by an enormous margin, because if we look at these soul rot factories on the earlier PMs, they do take hardwood in particular or specifically, and so we were trying to push down the input price of these. But all in all, this has led to a run with these guys that feels a lot differently than the other run we started on this mod. So again, quick note, the map is all janked up because they've updated the map since we played this run, but we started at the Vozmead Peaks, which is a nation of hardy dwarves, and we have become the Yavaz. There are several things going on. One, just kind of want to highlight, as far as resources go, there's a ton of, in particular, cloud silver mines, a ton more in terms of our relative start condition, as well as there's basically 0 haunted grounds, and so except for some territory we recently acquired, and so this encourages us to lean in a little bit of a different direction. An example of this is that if we take a look at over here, instead of ports, we can build the very similar airship dock. The airship dock takes airships. Airships are very similar to ports, except for they take cloud silver in their production instead of kind of the other stuff, and so we also have a ton of airship potentials here, which really allows us to kind of lean into this in terms of facilitating a lot of trade, and this is kind of when you have two options, and one has an input that has one type of track and one has an input that has a different type of track, just like how we had that labor-saving PM that we were using differently in the mines. This allows us to kind of further specialize in one thing or another. But kind of moving on to talk about our bonuses, we are dwarves, so we get dwarven engineering. We cannot build pops in the same way. The dwarves have another pop building thing, but it's nowhere near as robust as the gnomes. They can get unpetrified dwarves. The dwarves chose to petrify themselves while the gods were battling, with the understanding that their god would wake them up, but unfortunately both the gods went to sleep, so now they're waking up way later. But they do output a little bit of pops. You can't build them as manufactories. You build them basically in the equivalent of collapsed gold mines, but we also have all these bonuses here. In particular, we have state construction efficiency, infrastructure, radicals and loyalists modifiers, mortality modifier, and the modifier that I think relates to comparative advantage, at least slightly, which is political strength of engineers. And we also have laws that are a little bit different on game start in terms of having artificer guilds, with further give political strength to machinists and artificers, all of which allow you to get a relatively early trade unionist kind of powerful. This allows you to focus a little bit more on manufactories, which I do think is a little bit interesting, but manufactories are distinct from a separate type of industry that we haven't really covered too much, which is magic industries. And so you would have a specialization of kind of the two different types of manufacturing industries. There are just regular and also an example of the magic industries is the Gizmo Workshop. So the throughput we get for manufactories will not apply to the Gizmo Workshop because this is magic manufactories. And I don't think we drew this realization kind of when we were playing as these guys initially, and we probably would have played a little bit differently, but we ended up leaning into gizmos a little bit. And if we look at our trade routes here, we will be able to see kind of where things have shaken out, where we are actually exporting a ton of tools. And the reason for this is we have stacked a ton of tools manufacturing modifiers, and this is allowing us to have a trade route situation that looks much different than kind of the other condition. And if we take a look at our Arcana cards, we'll start to see a little bit of a bigger picture. So we do have in our menu Arcana cards state construction efficiency and explosives and steel mills building throughput. Steel, importantly, is an input for tools. So if you pull down the price of tools, you could also pull down the price of, if you pull down the price of steel, you can pull down the price of tools, which allows you to export more of it. And we also have manufacturing industries throughput. On top of this, we also have radicals and loyalists, which importantly is very useful for getting war bonuses while maintaining high taxes. And this is a lot lot of radicals and loyalists. We're kind of really leaning into trying to get the trade unionists big and happy in order to get the 20% manufacturing industries throughput, really stacking a lot of these modifiers. But as far as companies go, we do have this company, which looks quite strong. It does require a specific law that we start out with that is a little bit hard to swap onto, but not too bad. But it gives tools, iron, and gizmos. So we are leaning into the gizmos a little bit. We do have iron and lead, and we do have coal and sulfur. But on top of that, we will be getting a lot of throughput on both glass and furniture, and we probably should have leaned into this a little bit more, and maybe gizmos a little bit less, because this is a magic industry. So it is going to be a little bit distinct, but it has led to a kind of different gameplay pattern, you know, not just us having a different sort of thing overall, but a lot of things that we want utilize gizmos. So to kind of take a look, remember we said we had a lot of cloud silver, so we could do a lot of airship stuff. The airship stuff, input gizmos. So we've ended up leaning into gizmos a little bit, which is a different type of good. And in particular, their PM looks really good at the end for their final PM, but the kind of earlier PM for gizmos is not very good. Here we also have Wizard Towers, which is the ownership building for magical industries, and Adventuring Guilds, which is a separate ownership building for a few types of building that relate to heroes and adventurers, which is a little bit beyond the scope of kind of what we wanted to talk about here. But we were looking for gizmos. So we see we have a bunch of different gizmo workshops, and if we take a look at gizmos in the market, because this is something we tried to focus on in this run, although it maybe would have been a little bit different with an elf run. We see just how many stuff is using gizmos as input. We see a ton of textile mills are using them, construction sector, glassworks, coal mines, potion distilleries, which is a magical industry, but they are very, very present in a bunch of industries, which are manufacturing industries. So it's not terrible that we focus them a little bit, but these different chains and different options for similar PMs that have different sort of feeder things has led to, in my opinion, a very interesting kind of series of gameplays. The easiest one to focus on is we're going to be using advanced rock rollers if we use a labor-saving PM, although I think we're using rock rollers in a bunch of places because we've leaned into gizmos rather than using one that has coal input, although we do have a coal industry. Maybe we should do this one instead. The thing is, we don't have an efficiency towards producing engines, except we do have a lot of manufacturing industry. As you can see, even now, going back over it, we are thinking through these things, and they are interesting to do, but it is very, very refreshing to see the runs look so different in terms of what trade routes are good for us in a way that we could not have played this differently in some sense, or we could have played it differently, but we could not have accessed the same sorts of resources that allowed the, Ravik run that we had taken a look at previously to have the same looking advantages to this Yavaz run because we didn't have access to the same cards. We didn't have access to the ability to build pops. We didn't have access to output bonuses on iron and coal, which I'm not sure it would have been better or worse. It's a really tough to tell because state construction efficiency is a tremendous modifier, but it doesn't force us to focus on anything. Although we do have explosives and steel alongside that, it doesn't force us to focus on any particular industry in the same way an iron and coal output bonus does. But there are no unique companies notably in this mod, but this gameplay differences that are small relative to what country you're playing, I think is really fascinating. Another one I'd like to highlight is the Yulag Authority, which are goblins, which are kind of the equivalent of China in the sense that they have an enormous amount of population and are relatively backwards. But if we take a look at their unique kind of Goblin Tide, which is their unique tech relative to their race, we will see some interesting modifiers, right? We will see war exhaustion from casualties, super down. They basically don't generate war exhaustion from casualties. They will have some negative modifiers from army offense, defense, and morale loss that apparently I'm told you can get rid of through events. I don't know their event chains. And they have this minus military goods cost. So, minus military goods cost, when you stack a lot of it, is insane. Now, in vanilla, you can stack up to 65% with China. With the Goblin Tide, you can stack up to 60%, but this minus 25% is much more consistent. And this could lead to, just to kind of give another example of ways you could specialize, this could lead to an economy where what you do is you overbuild the military by a considerable margin, and then this minus military goods cost is a free money modifier. You use it to stimulate your economy, have excess buy orders in the economy that nobody has to pay for, which pushes prices up, which allows industries to be more profitable. It's effectively phantom money. You could do it as China, but generally it doesn't pay off until really later, but it's maybe something you could go for with these guys, which is a bit interesting. But then once you have a bunch of companies, once you slot in a bunch of companies, that are oriented towards these arms industries, like for example the Metalworks Consortium, which as far as vanilla companies go, because they're all vanilla companies, isn't even really that bad. It also gives you army offense, defense, so you can throw your weight around, and importantly it's giving you tools on top of the normal ones, but the one that you would have to slot in for this strategy would be the Explosives Company, which again is not a terrible company. Explosives industry is relatively good. Here's the Gizmo unique one that we kind of took a look at. Where's the explosives one? Oh no, we've lost him. Where is he? Bueller. Well, the explosive industry, very importantly, does give you minus military goods cost, which is why you have to use it. And it also gives ammunition. And so what you could do is you could slot in this company, you could slot in the arms company, and then you could start overproducing these things. And exporting them, because you're slotting your way into an advantage with these things. You could also take a look at the Arcana, and we will see we have Justice and Dragon. We could take a look at what we could get here. Minus enactments, probably not that useful, but we do have access to, hey, coal and iron output modifiers, so we can lean into that in addition to our tooling modifier, or our tooling company, and also the explosives company. We would probably want to use the coal and an iron company and utilize this. I think this is kind of the Magic Industries throughput maybe we would end up using. I'm not sure all the mobilization options. Notably, you get a discount on all mobilization options, if I'm not mistaken, not just military goods, like specifically. So if you're using opium, you would get a discount on that as well. We see plus infamy decay, fairly strong modifier, workforce ratio, qualifications, mortality, nothing that relates too much to the economy, and so we would be kind of running it like that. But as far as mobilization options go, all of these things would get cheaper, and so we would be able to kind of focus on these industries, overbuild them, effectively overconsume them, and do this sort of thing. I think that they are going to come back in and add a whole lot more in terms of mobilization options, but right now it looks relatively like vanilla with a couple exceptions in terms of substitutions. You notice here there is, down at the very bottom, blubber is a different thing that could be input. It is distinct from God's blood, which is the equivalent of oil, and you can see potions input here. But you could have an economy that is more military based, based on Yulag's authority or any goblin's kind of unique bonus, and this would play differently than other countries, and you're playing to a particular strength. And in vanilla, there is no specialization in this regard, because no countries are receiving unique tech or unique bonuses, unique cards in this way, and as a result, all the playthroughs, you tend to specialize in the exact same thing. But that's not felt the case in this mod, which has been very, very refreshing, like any sort of appeal to a fantasy world aside. The gameplay pattern not feeling exactly the same, and being able to be like, hey, I can specialize in this different thing with this different setup, has been incredibly refreshing to play as. And so I would recommend you at least take a look at this. These don't seem balanced, but kind of who cares, because you can run over the AI no matter what. It is changing the style in which you run over the AI, and I think that that's a very interesting thing. I don't know how well balanced it'd be for multiplayer. If we take a look kind of at the starting condition, well, this isn't too far off of... Well, it's far off the start of the starting condition, but with the starting condition, power levels are relatively even, so this is maybe something you could run in multiplayer. I don't know how stable it would be. There's a whole lot going on. But I definitely would recommend this. I'm not going to summarize what we went through with talking about the comparative advantage, because a lot of it was just kind of leading up to the points of distinction between, I think, this mod, or ways in which this mod allows for further comparative advantage relative to vanilla, such that your gameplay feels a lot different. So this will be the conclusion of the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this semi-essay styles tutorial, it's like half essay, half tutorial, half mod spotlight, which I know you're saying that's 1.5 videos, but to be fair, this is a 1.5 video length, so there we go. If you like this kind of style, please feel free to let me know, because this has been a little bit different than anything else we've done. And other than that, oh yeah, YouTube algorithm stuff, you know, comment below, shake your fists in the air, get up and take a walk if you've been sitting a while, because it's good for your health. And other than that, have a good one.